Good. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this launch of our IISS strategic dossier on Iran's networks of influence in the Middle East. About 18 months ago, the IISS had an idea. It was that we wanted to carry out some in-depth research and analysis of Iran's use of third-party partners. And we realized that there was a lot of interest in governments about Iran's activities in the region, but there was no reliable and extensive database of the nature of Iran's activities, the types of actors with whom they collaborated, the nature of the command and control networks they managed, the range of influence operations conducted, the geographic extent of this activity, the speed, direction, and style of Iranian power projected, or the quality of this specific transnational way of warfare that Iran was aiming to master. And our judgment was that no sound government policy, diplomacy, or strategy could be crafted without a reliable fact base, and this is what the IISS set out to produce. We engaged a number of analysts, including Arabic and Farsi speakers, regional and country specialists, military and defense professionals, specialists in hybrid and so-called gray zone warfare techniques, cybersecurity professionals, and also experts in finding and assessing open source intelligence. Elements of the team also conducted field research, and quite rigorous procedures were followed to confirm information gathered and place really careful interpretation on the raw data that we gathered. And the result is the first comprehensive taxonomy and analysis of Iran's influence networks ever published, and one which we believe is of the quality to attract the highest level of attention even amongst the best informed and resourced governments. The dossier assesses a sovereign capability of Iran and the way it is marshaled. We arrive at a number of key findings about that capability. First, we wanted to shed clear and careful analytical light on Tehran's ability to fight by, through, and with third parties, and building on our already substantial knowledge of Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities that we documented in a couple of previous strategic dossiers, we want to weigh the value of networks against Iran's other assets and to understand how they confer strategic advantage on Iran in the region. And our basic conclusion is that this sovereign capability has matured dramatically through successful deployments in recent conflicts in the Middle East to the point where it now tips the balance of effective force in the region in Iran's favor. And that's a significant statement. So let me add a few points that draw from it. First, that statement about the balance of effective force. This sovereign capability to conduct remote warfare and influence operations through third parties in foreign jurisdictions is designed, resourced, and deployed by Iran as its principal means of countering regional adversaries and international pressure. It has encountered no effective international response. Rather, it has consistently delivered advantage to Iran without the cost or risk of direct confrontation with adversaries. And as such, it's become Tehran's weapon of choice. In recent and continuing conflicts, this sovereign capability has given Iran strategic advantage over adversaries who rely on conventional weapons and capabilities or seek to match Iran in the use of third parties. Let me explain what we mean by that effective balance of force and why we have concluded this balance is now in Iran's favor. The conventional military balance remains heavily in favor of the US and its allies. However, it's critical to understand the conventional balance of force no longer determines advantage in regional conflict. Iran is fighting and winning wars fought amongst the people, not wars between states. Iran avoids symmetrical state-on-state conflict, knowing it will be outgunned, and instead it pursues asymmetric warfare through non-state partners. The strategic value of these networks for Iran is greater than that of its conventional forces, its ballistic missile capability, or even its rejuvenating nuclear program. This asymmetric warfare poses a considerable challenge, as Iran's adversaries cannot rebalance the effective force in the region by the application or accumulation of more conventional force. Conventional force has neither deterred nor limited the steady development of Iran's sovereign capability over the last 40 years. It has, on the contrary, strengthened Iran's commitment to this asymmetric doctrine. This way of war has paid off strategically for Iran, giving it a peculiar fitness for today's conflicts in the Middle East, which are not defined by state-on-state warfare involving parity of forces subject to international law, but are complex and congested battle spaces involving no rule of law or accountability, low visibility, and multiple players who represent a mosaic of local and regional interests. Iran has developed a capability to fight and win this kind of war, eliminating geography and engaging in a gray zone of conflict that maintains hostilities below the threshold of state-on-state warfare. Below the threshold asymmetric warfare using non-state partners fits with the nature and means of the Iranian regime. It espouses a revolutionary ideology and stands as a state apart. Iran often leverages the cultural affinities of Shia communities across the region, appeals to threatened minorities, and propagates its revolutionary ideology. And that approach makes its asymmetric warfare both affordable and sustainable, despite Iran's financial isolation. And our research underscores the variety of Iran's partnerships across the region, with a specific focus on questions of 1, ideological affinity, 2, strategic convergence, 3, political expediency, and 4, transactional value. That allows for a more nuanced understanding of Iran's network. Hezbollah, for example, the region's most militarily capable non-state actor, is an ideological ally of Iran and fights alongside it in other theaters. The Houthis do not embrace Iran's ideology, but they do have common strategic objectives. The relationship with Hamas, meanwhile, is largely transactional, and it's noteworthy that Iran has sought to cultivate also Sunni groups, reaching beyond its natural Shia constituency. An important aspect of Iran's affordable, sustainable, asymmetric warfare is that it seeks and takes opportunities. Weak states and divided societies are easy prey for Iranian influence. A fragile neighborhood is good hunting ground for Iran's way of warfare. In countries such as Syria and Yemen, Iran has pursued non-state partners opportunistically. In countries that have more competent governments, Iran's sovereign capability has been blunted and placed a limit on its ability to create the next Hezbollah. But it will often settle for weaker forms of influence and will continue to seek opportunities to deploy this capability in other places. And so the final conclusion I'll leave with you before passing on first to John Raine and then to Tom Beckett to offer more detailed reflections is this. Countering Iranian influence requires not only local responses, but a consideration of its sovereign capability as a whole, which has become the cornerstone of the regime's regional strategy. And with that, let me hand over to John Raine to add a few more reflections on our research. John.
Thank you, John.
It's on already.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In order to help you understand the dossier, I'll say a little bit about how we compiled it. The first question that we asked ourselves was, what would Iran's influence look like if we studied it as a military capability, rather than looking at it as just a series of state manifestations in theatres? So we took a very basic capability approach. We asked ourselves a number of questions. How does this thing work? What are the mechanics of it? on the ground and at the centre in Tehran. And first slide, please, Richard. You'll see that we have a number of tables in the dossier which are intended to capture, first of all, the variety and respective weight of the relationships. We set ourselves a number of questions related to very practical stuff, like what do these groups get from Iran, and then some more abstract things, where do they get the training, so on and so forth. What presence do commanders have alongside personnel in the field? Indeed, what is the footprint? And we found early on, as those of you who follow this subject know, you can't get the same level of information about all the theatres, and we were very cognizant of that. But just to stress, wherever we could, we rested this on research in the field, as well as a comprehensive survey of secondary and overt sources. Then we set ourselves a sort of rather difficult task of a comparative study. What's the relative weighting of these against one another? So you'll see that lots of the tables have this kind of RAG scoring on them, which is enabling you to see at a glance what the relative weight and style of these relationships are. So I don't necessarily want you to have to absorb all of this now, but just to give you an idea of the methodology that we're using in the dossier. And the first thing that we came up against, and indeed the most fundamental thing in our conclusion, is the breadth, variety and versatility of the relationships that Iran had fostered and instrumentalized. What we did not find was that Iran was seeking always to replicate a successful model. On the contrary, it was both adapting its level of engagement and the style and substance of its support to local circumstances. So you can see here the RAG ratings on their own show the differences that are there, and then the practical, the critical enabler stuff, that varies terrifically too. Then next slide. What we did want to look at, though, was when we'd done all that basic audit of the capability, the inventory, what do we actually know about the mechanics of this, how does it work, what's the strategic significance? We reached a number of strategic conclusions which are laid out in the final chapter, but there's also some practical implications to all of this. So what, as it were, has Iran got a concrete benefit from all of this? And we've tried to illustrate this both through graphics, more detailed studies of capabilities, reach, state penetration. This is just an example. I mean, 2 points of significance here. The much discussed land route, we put a lot of work into researching how that came about and how it will be maintained and kept open, and found that certainly in the case of the latter, the maintenance of lines of communication is done absolutely in line with Iran's strategy of leveraging third parties, local parties wherever possible, having a very small footprint, but then exploiting it ruthlessly for its own strategic purposes. Significant on here are the red circles which show where that has been attacked systematically by the Iranians, by the Israelis. You can see the southern line through town, we consider that to be temporarily not available to the Iranians, but the northern line very, very much is. And that, of course, connects through to Iraq, to their own networks of communications there, and then through into Lebanon. The second thing that I wanted to stress here, we have a separate chapter on Hezbollah because of the significance of Hezbollah. We found, as we did more and more research and work on Hezbollah, what became clear was that it had become an independent actor, very much a partner and less of a proxy for Tehran. And the most significant developments, which we looked at in some detail, was Iran's developed capability, Hezbollah's developed capability to operate as an expeditionary force in its own right. That is something which we believe made a significant contribution to the adjustment of the balance of effective force in the region. So two things there. One is that's a kind of concrete gain that came out of the strategic significance, and secondly, it's even more significant because of the enablement that it guarantees for Hezbollah through that connection to Iran. Next one, please, Richard. Here, another example of the graphics that we're using. I draw your attention here to not only the variety of the lines of communication that are being used from Tehran. You can see the blues relate to air links and the orange and the red to the ground links. But you'll also see that what effectively Iran has done here is to create an operational block or an extended theatre which runs from the Mediterranean through to the Iranian border. And Iran has systematically exploited that both for transferring capabilities and personnel across that theatre And conceptually, this has become extremely important to Iran. It is solidifying that now with an economic drive as well. We've seen economic agreements signed between the three countries under Iranian facilitation and tutelage. So that bloc is emerging from a series of conflicts into something which Iran can and is using for her own purposes of defense and projection. The next one, Richard. Here we wanted, in the assessment of usefulness to Iran, to draw out two things. One is the all-up value of these relationships to Iran, and secondly, a more textured understanding of what each one of the relationships brings. And in particular, we wanted to try to help people understand that a universal approach to Iran and partnerships is not going to be effective. They are all intrinsically different in design, purpose, and probably longevity. This was relatively easy to bring out. It's harder then to weigh one relationship against another, some which are of tactical value, and one could argue that many of the relationships with militias in Iraq fall into that category in Syria, also have quite high strategic value if there's armed conflict going on at the time. At the bottom, we've got the relationship with Ansarallah, with the Houthis. Our understanding of that developed as we concluded our studies, and we see that as having quite a high strategic value. But you'll see from the rank scores, it's actually not something which is umbilical in its connection to Iran in the same way that Lebanese Hezbollah right at the top is. And I think for policymakers, that's something to consider. You have something of high strategic value, but it's not necessarily as welded to the Iranians. That's relevant, I think, when you get into settlement as well as whilst conducting armed conflict. So again, what we were pushing to bring out here was the variety which you can get from just looking at the colours and the rag scores, as it were, and then also some of the themes that run through this. Managing this amount of variety, this spread of assets and this whole theatre led us to two important discoveries. One is that that's the view that the Iranians take too, that this is effectively one whole theatre. And the most graphic illustration of that has been their willingness to move both IRGC and recruited third-party personnel around the theatre. And the second was their ability to use assets deployed through partners in various theatres to achieve one aim. So you can turn it in one place, you can turn it down in another. Much of this is held together by Qasim Soleimani and the IRGC Quds Force. But what it is a consolidated and coordinated effort. It's not a series of state manifestations by accident on the basis of opportunities that presented themselves. That was the first thing that we looked at. And the secondly was obviously embedded in all of this is a huge amount of risk for the Iranians, is that they are possibly, it's hard to know, surprised at the amount of success they've enjoyed and strategic advantages that they've generated, but it is not without risks. First of all, overstretch. This is a big theatre to command and to dominate. And secondly, the nature of many of these relationships, because they don't all score, 3 red dots, means that there are risks to their longevity. Local agendas may be more important, strategic affinity, cultural alignment, all of those things may actually be not strong enough. And some of the reaction against Iranian presence that we're seeing in Iraq, I think, is indicative of that. So we have flagged that up as an inherent risk. And the third risk is that local agendas dominate over Iranian strategic considerations. And given the ferocity of some of the fighting and what's at stake for local parties, there is a high risk that that will occasionally get the Iranians into a difficult, unsustainable position with a partner. Against all of that, we found that the Iranians consciously manage these risks. And a policy of test and adjust has been evidenced both at the tactical and operational level, where they have been conducting combat operations, and at the strategic level. Next one, please, Richard. So just to conclude my comments, and to further advertise what's in the dossier, we tried in one graphic to do what many of our colleagues have tried to do, which is to bring out the extent of Iranian influence. It's very hard to do with binary colours on a map. Sometimes respective geography and landmass is a little bit distorting. But this I'm mentioning both because it is in some ways a summary of what we had found now constitutes Iran's network of influence, and also because this is interactive, so those of you who go online will be able to see as this little clip shows, you can click on and then get an understanding of what we think are the key criteria to watch. So levels of state penetration, relationships with the host government, and trend lines too. I mean, we were very concerned that this is not entirely static in the view of the Iranians, and although we had to have a cut-off point of June for our study, we will of course be continuing to follow this. The overall effect of this, I hope, is to give people an understanding, whether you're online or looking at the paper version, that what we're looking at here is both something that's very unconventional. The Iranians are holding together a very loose federation of players. There is no constitutional basis, no treaties that bind them, there's no annexation involved here. And secondly, as well as being unconventional, it is extremely effective. So the strategic gains that has delivered the Iranians so far are material to Iran, and it has pre-positioned them in a number of conflicts to be influential and critical to post-conflict settlement. That's true in Syria, possibly also true in Yemen. And thirdly, just to leave through the texture that we've given there in the graphic itself with some of the shading, just an understanding that, as John was saying at the beginning, when you're talking about military power projected by, with and through the people, it is very difficult to come up with binary metrics for this. The challenge itself is understanding just how detailed and textured those relationships can be, and the capability that it generates is. So I hope that you enjoy reading the dossier, and for those of you who go online, please also enjoy playing with the graphics. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Tom, who'll say a little bit about the important military dimensions of this.
Yes, so what I'll do is just briefly try and describe Iran's ability to be effective on the ground, and I've chosen 4 key headings for that, but I'll skate through them pretty quickly. The first one John mentioned at the beginning is command and control. The interesting thing about Iranian command and control is that it's not always command and it's not always control, but it is an ability to communicate their intent and communicate it quite effectively. And the reason they can do that is because either they or through their partners have local knowledge. They're able to identify local seams and fissures. They're able to express common goals and determine expedient measures through which they can achieve those common goals. So if I give an example, when Daesh rolled into northern Iraq in the middle of 2014, if you look at some of the reactions to it, the first American bomb dropped was in August of 2014, and that was to protect the consulate in Erbil. The first counter-Daesh coalition bomb that was dropped was in September by the time they'd pulled together that coalition. Before both of those, Iranian artillery was already in operation in Iraq in support of the Iraqis. Before any of those, the Iranians had already visited Erbil to offer up to 2,000 troops to protect Erbil. So their ability to understand and have that ground picture, identify a common goal. Interestingly, they made that offer in the KDP part of Kurdistan region of Iraq, and it wasn't accepted. But they still had an ability to express a common intent. The second part of their ability to work on the ground and achieve effect on the ground is the application of mass. And again, it's in an unconventional sense in the application of mass, because they do it through their partners rather than necessarily through themselves. But it's not an attritional application. It's a persistent application of mass. And in that time, they're able to identify, again, those local seams and fissures so that they can avoid, in many cases, fighting. So a lot of the fighting is an absence of fighting, and it's an application of pressure. A very interesting dimension, I think, of the Iranian exposure on the battlefields of the recent decade is their willingness to be technologically innovative at the lower and simpler levels. Whether it was in the US-led coalition campaign in Iraq between 03 and 11, they supplied machine precision explosively formed projectiles which could defeat most of the coalition's armor. In more recent campaigns, their use of UASs, drones in Yemen and in Syria and Iraq, and interestingly also in Yemen, the supply of explosive boats. The supply of those explosive boats threatens the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. It's a simple measure, but what they're doing effectively is they have an operational laboratory. If conflict is about measure and countermeasure, they're looking at the measures in place and they're trying to figure out low cost, simple solutions to defeat those. And those are 3 good examples of that. And then the last piece is their oversight, and it's been brought out by both John Shipman and John Rain, on hand in small numbers, whether it's small numbers of IRGC or Hezbollah in Yemen, whether it's small numbers in Iraq, but it's also the key figures, the Soleimani, his persistent presence around the campaigns. But also, if you note, and it's in the dossier, the large number of, or the high number of senior officers who've been killed, demonstrating their willingness to get to the front of the battlefield and apply that oversight which local forces and partner forces need to make them effective on the battlefield. But they also have that oversight remotely, where they are willing from Tehran, from Iran, to provide oversight, often through exiles, so that they can communicate their message. So from my perspective, from my view, and from the overall view, is if you characterize the Western coalition approach to these campaigns, one could say that they are an economy of effort wrapped up in quite stringent compliance measures. On the other hand, Iran appears to be ruthlessly determined to achieve its goals. So the military strategic challenge is figuring out how economy of effort, strict compliance can compete against ruthless determination.
Tom, brilliant. Thank you very much. Happy to have a conversation. So if any of you have questions to ask or further detail you'd like us to drill down into, Mark Champion, Bloomberg.
Thank you. Just you had that chart where you were trying to map out the level of umbilical connection of the different militias to Iran, and it struck me that there's one equivalent that the US has, which was the SDF, YPG, whichever however you want to look at it. If you were putting that on your map, what would it look like?
That's the next dossier, Mark. It raises a very interesting point here, is that so the Iranians do this, what's our, if you like, what's the Western version of it? I think it would look very different. First of all, cultural affinity, this term that we came up with, can be misleadingly dry and anthropological, because actually the bonds that tie some of these fighting groups, and I'm thinking in this case actually some of those that were recruited in Afghanistan or Pakistan, that tie them to Iran are profound, and have led to an almost irrational loyalty to the Supreme Leader himself and to Iran. And that's not something that we have been able to exploit because it doesn't exist in the same way. So there is something very special about the ties amongst the global Shia community. Not all of them have this by any means, and we've tried to bring out why that's not the case. Particularly in the Gulf, traditionally, Shia communities don't have that connection with Iranian Shia. The Maraja are not there, for example. But that is an advantage which they have exploited, and the traditional concepts of transnational Shia mobilization, which are actually Shia, even though again it sounds like Western academic terminology, it's the Shia equivalent of that. All of these things have been consciously exploited by the Iranians and have given them a sort of depth of connection which we don't have. I think the columns that would look very different, and this is to John's point, is of course the instinct has always been, the practice has been to support a proxy as essentially a portal through which you apply conventional force. And even if it's only to cue airstrikes or whatever, that's ultimately how you're going to fight through third parties. Or you arm them as an out-and-out armed force. The difference is the Iranians have found this very different thing to do with them. So if you look at the column, which is the package of things that they give them very specific weapon systems to a specific task. They don't try to put the whole force of the state through that particular portal. They try to enable them to fight in a particular environment with often a local long-term agenda. So, great question, Mark. I think that the tables of the RAG scores would look very different. Some will be stronger, but some key things would be weaker. Tom?
I think maybe just one observation is it took the US-led coalition some time to down select on the SDF. What was always amusing was the coalition was trying to put together an overt. There was an overt program of trying to get some tribal resources together. The interesting thing is, as soon as you say there's an overt program, it means there's also a covert program, and neither of them worked. It was only until they could find a common goal with the largely Kurdish-led SDF that they could find that, which Iran didn't have that issue. It had, through that transnational piece, many more actors that it could work through.
Also, sorry to help self-seconds, Mark, but we'd have to have another column on legal, constitutional and electoral constraints. And that would have 3 red stars in it, I'm afraid. It's just a hard reality of the asymmetry.
Yeah.
In the first row here, yes, go ahead.
Mohammed Shakir from Equinor. The terms that you've used, ruthless determination, resilience, balance of effective force, and then you have Iraq currently going through mass protests, opposition, a lot of it to Iran, given the banners that are up there, and allegedly Iranian snipers out there shooting Iraqis. How does Iraq play into the future of Iraq play into Iran? Will Iran lose Iraq, given the current violence?
Can I ask a corollary, because this is related? Sorry, Bobby Grosh, also Bloomberg.
Hi, Bobby.
What is based on what you've learned about the way Iran, Qasem Soleimani manages? You were saying that there's a management of all these relationships. What is your best guess as to how Qasem Soleimani now manages Iraq?
Great. Okay, so 3 principles first, and a more practical one. The first one was the supreme strategic importance of Iraq. So having got it, it really, really matters to them. And in some ways it was windfall through mismanagement of the coalition. In other ways it wasn't. It was the fruit of long-term, careful positioning. It's so strategic it matters that they will stay. The second is a development at a more general point is in none of the theatres that we looked at had Iran sacrificed strategic gain. So if Iran gets a strategic gain, it hangs on to it. And it goes to the theme of persistence and the length of their planning scales, which Tom brought out on the military paramilitary dimensions, but is also true geopolitically. So sorry to switch theatres, Bobby, but when we were thinking about this in Yemen, what are they doing in Yemen? Won't they just go home? I'll be interested to see. Chances are they'll hang on, and they've won strategic and military advantage there. They'll want to hang on to it. But so that's a bit of a test, but in Iraq, no doubt they'll hang on. And the third principle is their ability to adjust and vary, to tone up and dial down. And we saw this in the deployment in Syria, where they tried the besiege option first, the preferred option. You have a parallel force that sits outside of the state. That wasn't going to be enough. They sacrificed that, which was quite important for them, in order to get the strategic win, which was to do the most effective thing to guarantee Bashar's survival. So those are the 3 principles in play. I think the practical thing, Qasem Soleimani, is I bet they're really up close to this. I mean, they don't, when things are critical to them, they don't just let them run. Interventions are at the highest level and critical, as we saw, frankly, over Qasem Soleimani prepared to go to Russia to make sure that it went the right way in Syria. But, sorry, my final point on this is there's a lot of embarrassment here. I mean, if they were looking at their risk register, they're deep into the red. And this is the risk they don't want to materialise, which is a coordinated pushback of Iraqi-led Arab Shia nationalism. That's a nightmare for them. So they're right in the risk zone. They've got a package of measures. We've seen them roll out before. I expect to see them here.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Jonathan Rugman from Channel 4 News. The Saudis and the Israelis would say that they've been telling us this for years. Everything we've laid out in great detail. I wondered whether you could say something about the policy response, because we've been aware of this asymmetric sort of crescent of influence, and nobody's been able to persuade the Iranians to change their behaviour. And it doesn't seem as if what you're saying about what's happening in Iraq or what's happening in Lebanon is going to change that. So are you more sympathetic to Donald Trump's argument that there needs to be a new kind of deal, because he takes all this very much into account in his arguments about the Iran nuclear deal? Or are you saying, well, it's their region, it's not ours, it's all fairly predictable, and actually we can't do much about it.
Let me take a first crack of that and then see what John and Tom might want to add to that. First, our intention in publishing this dossier was to address with facts this discussion about Iran's activities in the region, which was generally talked about, but had not received actually very much forensic examination. Of course, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Israelis and others have been talking for some time about the fact that Iran has various capabilities in the region. A number of them have often averred that this capacity, as we ourselves conclude, is potentially of much more strategic consequence than their nuclear program or their ballistic missile program. The sensitivities in the region to this persistent engagement of Iran in the domestic politics of the region are very high. But in this dossier, we didn't want to pollute the authority of the study by coming up with a series of policy recommendations. As you know, we published a military balance, which assesses air, land, sea, increasingly now cyber power of a number of states in the world, and we want to measure and define this capability. And that's why we think an important conclusion of this dossier, which might sound banal, is that this is a sovereign strategic capability and perceived as such by the Iranian national security establishment. There are a couple of things that resonate for policymakers from our conclusions. The first is that because this is a core capability, it is probably relatively sanctions resilient. Maximum pressure is often by Iran met by maximum resistance. And this is such an important capability to it that it won't be easily financially sanctioned away. The second conclusion is that obviously Iran has been able to exercise this capability most effectively in societies, governments, nations that are weak, and where stronger governance exists, where a sense of national identity is stronger, Iran's ability to infiltrate and affect governance is weaker. So those are some of the factors that have to be taken into account. What we do believe is that it's no good having a specific policy towards Syria or one towards Yemen or one towards another country in which Iran might be exercising influence. One has to step back and look at this as a strategic capability. And there will be different answers to this question that will be provided by the United States, the UK, Europe, the Gulf Arab partners. But as it were, phase two of strategic thinking on this is exactly what you say, how to develop a strategic response to this capability that is so core to Iran's strategic identity. I don't know whether John or Tom want to add a few more things that...
to endorse what John said, the first thing that all of us who've been talking about this for years, actually hadn't done was said, so how does it work? So that thing's out, but how does it actually work? So we took this rather clinical orders of capability approach just to try to understand how it worked. And that meant we had to free ourselves of policy considerations and some of the rather heated rhetoric around this, some of which is entirely valid, some of which is not so helpful. So we did the dry approach first. And then the second thing was, so whilst we haven't been doing anything about this for so many years, what has happened? And so as it were, as the gun smoke clears in Syria and other conflicts, we just wanted to try to capture, so just how much influence has Iran generated and what is its nature? So in both those cases, we had to distance ourselves a little bit from policy considerations. But our purpose in doing it was to facilitate the discussion. And the most obvious thing, as John has said, if you line this capability up with Iran's other capabilities, which the international community has addressed, so its rocketry and its ballistic missile capability, its nuclear capability, this is the one which has received least systematic addressing. And whilst we've not been addressing it, look what's happened.
But I mean, you must have thought to yourself, even if it wasn't part of your study,
Yes, and you know, we've all thought about it on a personal basis, and I think there are definitely there's a question of where this features as a priority in the international community's work with Iran. There are two ways of reining Iran in, through force and persuasion, and Iran is amenable to both, but not in absolute terms. So you want to question, as John has said, if we have been prosecuting a policy of accumulating conventional weaponry with an intent of detaining Iran, how effective has that been? That's a question to ask, and that's policy relevant. And secondly, if this is the way Iran gets its way and fights its wars, is it also the thing we should talk to them about most? But we've not put these, for the reasons I give, into the dossier. These are personal reflections. There are other policy individuals in the room who might like to comment on it. I hope they will. That's why we're doing it.
Yeah, so some of my personal reflections are exactly as John has said. So when you would look at Iranian behaviour, you would look at it not as Dr. Chipman has said in a complete sense, but in a country sense. So your response would be focused on a country. And when you did stand back and try and look at it in a complete sense, you'd go, actually, it's really difficult. And we didn't necessarily, in coordination with the deep discussions going on for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, to have the bandwidth to ramp up against that difficulty, or to really figure out how, when you're taking an economy of effort approach, which is within strict compliance regime, how you do deal with the ruthless behavior. So there was a policy, the policy wanted to achieve that, wanted to figure it out, but just didn't have the bandwidth at times. Because it didn't also recognize how important this capability was for Iran.
Yeah, let me just get here first. Yeah, go ahead.
So how do you fit what's been happening in Saudi Arabia into this structure? Because in Saudi Arabia, as the dust clears and as the Iranian hand becomes clearer and clearer, it seems as though actually they haven't trusted proxies sufficiently to do something as complicated, dangerous, and calibrated as they've been doing there, that therefore they don't really have the trust and confidence in their proxies to deliver the effect that they need when it comes to something really significant like this.
There may have been technical reasons for that, in that we did a separate study talking about the attacks on Après. Yeah.
Well, and the 3-4 months of...
And the tankers,
building,
yeah. And it may quite simply have been that to have that done either by the Houthis or by other proxies would not have got the very specific result thereafter. We did a separate study on drones and you know, what capabilities were most suitable to this. The question of trusting them, though, is an interesting one, because we did find there are, whilst the Iranians are happy to trust their partners in these theatres, ultimately the prosecution of Iranian interests, the protection of Iranian interests, is done through the best means available. So they're not obligated always to work through them. There are some groups they wouldn't trust because they're not capable enough, and some because they're not aligned enough. So again, you know, they have situated this capability within this kind of broad suite that any nation has. It's what we are arguing is very much more central than we thought, certainly for them, their day-to-day calculations of how they get what they want.
Mark again, then we'll go back. Yeah.
Have you put your report in front of the Iranians, or do you plan to?
Yeah, I think they've already commented.
I think they've already commented on it, and they haven't contested any of the findings in it, and I think they acknowledge that this is an activity which is an important national purpose of Iran. So I certainly haven't been rung up yet complaining about the assessment or the breadth of coverage or detail that we provided. You again, then we'll not to worry. I won't. Yeah.
On that, so may I ask about the financial calculations? Because as the Guardian, I was reading on the way here, I think the Guardian already knew what you were all going to be saying, but they put various prices quoting you on this. How confident are you of the cost, the financial cost to Iran?
Well, the figure's a bit of a mystery because I don't actually think that's one that, I mean, we will check on that, but I don't think that's one that we were using. But we when we started doing this, we thought how much attention do we want to give to the finance of this? And it would have involved quite a lot of specialist forensic work, which has defeated various governments. So we thought we probably can't get that. So we took a more sort of typological approach. So what are the various sources of finance? And we shied away from using hard, all-up figures, often because they are very unreliable and often reflect what you regard as constituting the capability rather than a particularly accurate figure. But on the typology, we were struck, first of all, by how many of the costs are laid off. So costs raised locally, particularly by Iraqi groups and Syrian groups, through everything from organised crime through to embezzlement, helping themselves to just slices off state funds, and costs laid off to states too. So Syrians and Iraqis, Iraqi funding of the PMU is a great sort of windfall for the Iranians. And then there were also subventions too, the greatest of which from Iran is for Hezbollah, a figure that we're comfortable with, everybody knows it's 700 million a year. But the critical point for us was whether or not they were financially vulnerable, whether financial overstretch was a problem, and where we came out on that was probably not, simply because light footprint, tendency to, as it were, contractualize a lot of the work, meant that they had kept their costs down, with the exception of Hezbollah.
Yep.
Thank you. Ali Arsalan Pasha, I'm an intern here at IISS. My question is from John Rain. Do you think there is legitimacy in the concern that the evolution of Hezbollah from a proxy entity to a more complicit partner may lead to Tehran reconsidering its stance on nuclear armament as a means of expanding influence in the region?
That's not in scope of the dossier, but it's a perfectly legitimate question. Iranian determination to have their own nuclear capability is, we concluded, probably unaffected by this. Even though this is an extremely effective alternative, lower cost, lower risk politically capability, it doesn't perform the same function in the Iranian government psyche as the nuclear program. Whether, if they were to get it, which would be a negative development for the region, if they were to get it, would it affect this? It might not, because one of the things we wanted to draw out here was just the day-to-day usefulness of this capability. So you can do lots of stuff inside other jurisdictions. You can enter into conflicts, side with a warring party, use somebody else effectively to fight your battles. You could do it on a completely deniable basis. Not just that, you can do it on a ghostly basis, where all of this is very low cost politically. So, and it's low cost in other terms. So long as there are these conflicts in which Iran sees an interest to intervene, it will use this capability. So we thought it'd be very unlikely to see them dial this down, even if they had the protection, as they would see it, of a nuclear canopy.
The one column that was missing in your first chart was the degree to which Iran can turn up and turn down the dial on each of these groups in response to a crisis in Iran. So during much of the past year and a half in discussions about whether or not Trump sort of presses the button, so to speak, and launches a military attack on Iran, there's been some comment that Iran would immediately be able to activate these various groups to act on its behalf in all these other theaters. How accurate is that perception? I mean, will the Houthis immediately stop what they're doing and start attacking American or international shipping in the Red Sea? Or would the Iraqi militias start ratcheting up attacks on American presence in Iraq and so on and so forth? Or even go to third countries on Iran's behest?
We did look at this in each of the theatres, how tied was performance to Iranian as opposed to local objectives. Got very varied readings on this. Probably in Iran, in the case of Hezbollah, it's closest. But there it was a question too of reverse of what you say, the Iranians not wanting a partner to do something which could create an acceptable level of risk for Iran. Escalation is the big thing that they wanted to avoid. The calibration of the dial is not very fine. And what we found was that there were setting of broad parameters for operations, which entails a measure of risk, and that's probably it. But then, you know, opportunities would arise to do something which the Iranians thought was advantageous for them. There was sometimes discussion with proxies about that, and it didn't happen. Sometimes it did. The absolute red lines for Tehran, which there should be no attack on Iranian soil, no loss of Iranian soil, no mass Iranian casualties, all of which were hard lessons learned in the Iran-Iraq war. It's important to note that they wouldn't trust on this screen of partners to protect them from that. Ultimately, that's the responsibility of Tehran itself, and they would use all other measures for that.
Yeah.
Apologies for asking a third question. John, did you look at the tentacles outside of the region as well, and the extent to which they were important financially, the extent to which they posed a terrorist threat, as we sometimes hear from the American administration in particular, to Western interests?
We did. We decided only to look at those areas of influence which were playing into the theatres of armed conflict. So we did look at Pakistan and Afghanistan, and we looked cursorily at what the long-term significance of the Zainabi and Fatimiyun might be, but we did not want to dilute the scope of the study, because we're primarily interested about how Iran is involving itself in conflicts to get strategic gain. And we didn't look at terrorism just because out of scope, and for the other reason is that we very much wanted to look at this capability as though it were a military capability, as though in Iranian terms it were a conventional thing. And the problem with terrorism is it's very much more difficult to do because you can't get your hands on the data, and certainly we didn't have access to the kind of data that allows us to do that.
Good. Yes.
Sorry. When you're saying you're assessing it as a military capability, to what extent did you take into account Western willingness to act, or Western willingness to use soft power, hard power in the region to affect the Iranian, what Iran is trying to do with its networks? Was that something that was brought in?
Well, interestingly, Tom might want to say a bit about this, areas where we succeeded, but we didn't do that systematically. We just wanted to look at the Iranian side of the football field, if you like, and see how that team was playing. And on a number of occasions, you know, we had to make some sort of judgments about, you know, just where the Iranians not being able to manoeuvre, where they'd been denied space. But we were tempted to do that, but we didn't want it to shift our focus from the Iranians themselves.
Tom?
I suppose if you look back from the 2003 intervention in Iraq, the predominant problem was the Sunni-generated problem rather than the Shia-generated problem, even if the Shia-generated problem was recognized as an issue in the south of Iraq. And then if you look again from 2014 onwards, it was a counter-Daesh campaign, and as many people would say, the strength of the counter-Daesh coalition was its focus on Daesh. The weakness of the counter-Daesh coalition was its focus on Daesh, because what it didn't do was look at the other issues. Remember having a discussion when I was still in government service of, are we looking at Shia extremism? And people looking at me going, we don't have time, we're looking at Sunni extremism. So there was that problem all the time as well.
One more, and then we'll close. Yeah, go ahead.
Just drawing back the Saudi dimension to this again. Balance of forces in Iran's favour, as you're saying. The Al-Qaeda attack was ginormous by any stretch of the imagination. Where does that leave the Gulf Arab states? Without getting into policy prescription, what can they do if the Americans don't have the back? Do you foresee peace in the region?
Well, peace of a sort, and it's not a very comfortable peace, and I say that because, just holding with the dossier, it was clear that whilst the Iranians have all these ways of aggressing, they are absolutely determined to avoid what we would recognise as war. They can't afford it, and they'll lose. So this sort of peace, this disrupted peace, suits their purposes. and I'm sorry by sort of gloomy conjectures, until we come up with a way of combating this capability, that's likely to continue. Piece of a sort.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.